alumni group. For those of you who are new, our group is an interdisciplinary and intergenerational community of Stanford alumni engaged in careers around the environment and sustainability. Our vision is to create an impact network that is collectively working towards a sustainable future. And we hold social and educational gatherings for members, both virtual, like today, and also in person, and work to create an organized network to connect alumni and current students with advice, mentorship, and professional opportunities. We'll be posting links to subscribe to our newsletter in the chat shortly, and we invite you to join our Stanford groups and LinkedIn pages, which we'll also be posting for you to stay involved. So now over to our moderator, Tamaki.
Thanks, Claudia. Welcome to the Endangered Species panel hosted by Stanford Alumni in Sustainability. My name is Tamaki Bieri, your host for this webinar and a Stanford Biology PhD graduate. Currently, I work for the Nature Conservancy, where I focus on applying technology and design innovation to scale coral reef restoration around the world. The goal of today's panel is to provide an opportunity to get to know 3 Stanford wildlife experts who are at the forefront of endangered species conservation. Living in South Africa and doing field work across the African continent, Anna Haw, Jordana Meyer, and Simon Morgan will share new research about the future of wildlife conservation, where there is hope, and how we can approach imminent challenges. I'll now let the speakers introduce themselves briefly.
Thanks, Tamaki. I'll start. I'm Anna Haw. I am a wildlife veterinarian with a few other different hats and how I came to Stanford. I'm also a GSB grad 2018. I'll hand over to Jordana to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Jordana Meyer here. I'm wildlife conservation ecologist, geneticist, endocrinologist, and graduated, did a PhD in 2022 from Stanford, and currently working throughout Africa, and we will share what we're doing with you. Go ahead, Simon.
Hi, everyone. Simon Morgan. I currently sit as Associate Director for conservation for the Program for Conservation Genomics at Stanford University. And I am also the Chief Biodiversity Officer for Value Nature, which is a startup with a focus on biodiversity credits.
Thank you all. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items. So today's webinar will be 1 hour, and a recording of the webinar will be sent to registered attendees via email. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, and you can use the Q&A function anytime throughout the webinar to send questions, and we'll keep track of those for the end of the presentations. I'll now hand it over to the panelists to each give a 15-minute presentation. Anna will cover the state of wildlife conservation in Africa today, what has been done so far, what has worked, what hasn't, and the business of conservation. Jordana will talk about her work with environmental DNA and what it's used for, and Simon will share insights into biodiversity credits. Take it away, Anna.
Thanks, Tamaki. So, yeah, well, thank you very much. Great to be here, and thank you all for joining us. It's very wonderful to see so many on this call. So I would like to start with, is this moving forward? Yeah. Just a story, Operation Rhino. I don't know if many of you have heard of this or not. Feel free to put your hand up if you have heard of it, but hopefully not. And I'll just give a bit of a brief background on Operation Rhino to introduce conservation in Africa and South Africa, because Operation Rhino is really one of Africa's greatest conservation success stories. And so as a bit of background, in the sort of late 19th century, in the 1800s, much of the wildlife in this area in Southern Africa was killed by intense unregulated hunting, for skins and horn, and a lot of it by colonists, this just unregulated, extensive hunting. And so there were concerns that the southern white rhino was globally extinct. But then a small handful of rhino were found in this, what's now the Shihlui-Mfolozi Game Reserve, this sort of area here that I've covered in red, on the sort of eastern coast of South Africa. And, exact numbers change, but some say as few as 50 or fewer animals were here, but basically a very small population. And so this actually led to the establishment of Africa's first proclaimed nature reserve in 1895, and that is what's now the Shihlui-Mfolozi Game Reserve. So after the designation of the protection of designation of this nature reserve and the protection of these animals, the population did grow really well. And until about sort of 1950s, there were roughly about 400 rhino from this small handful of animals. But it then became clear, because this area was now fenced and these animals were in this protected zone, which was great, but there were concerns of overgrazing, even by wildlife, and also if a disease broke out, then that could just completely wipe out the entire population of white rhino, because there were no other white rhino in former ranges. They'd all been all died out. So it was then decided by the then park warden, Dr. Ian Player, that they needed to translocate these animals to former ranges so that they could establish other breeding herds, and that in that way save the species. And that's exactly what happened. They successfully, figured out how to immobilize and move these massive, 1 to 2 ton animals across countries and establish breeding herds within South Africa, especially, Kruger National Park, as well as throughout Southern Africa. And this was what Operation Rhino was. And it was so successful that, until about 2010, there were about 20,000 white rhino, roughly. So a huge success in saving this species. I'll get back to a bit of a rhino story in a bit and tell you a follow on, but just to link more about my story a bit, to give a bit of background, less on the whole of conservation, but feel free to ask questions along the way about conservation in general, but how my story fits in with conservation in Africa. So yeah, I'm a bit of a mixed bag, South African wildlife veterinarian, and as you see there, also an MBA, and I'll tell you a bit more about herding for health. So yeah, bear with me. I'll just give you a few snippets of my journey in the conservation world. So I started as a South African, as a wildlife veterinarian, and I was just always wanted to do conservation wildlife veterinary medicine. When I started out after my veterinary degree in wildlife, it was actually at a time when South Africa was going through the sort of private wildlife industry bubble. And so a lot of these private game reserves were breeding color variants and, specific animals that were fetching huge prices, mostly for the hunting industry. And I realized that wasn't really the type of conservation I was wanting to go in. A lot of these animals were farmed in small camps and not very natural setting. And so that's when I sort of turned to research and went into wildlife research. I did quite a bit on non-lethal predator control work with quite a lot of predators, and I joined, and I'm still part of this wildlife conservation physiology research group, where we're looking at sort of how large mammals are able to adapt to climate change and, through our research, hopefully influence management decisions on home ranges and how to care for animals, wild animals that are potentially being restricted because of some of our management decisions and compounded by climate change. And so there, this is just me with an aardvark. I don't know if any of you have ever seen an aardvark or know of an aardvark. Fascinating species, actually, and a keystone species. They live in burrows underground, which, and they sort of architects of the ecosystem. Lots of other animals use their burrows. And just a side anecdote, trying to dart aardvark. So this aardvark isn't dead, it's just sleeping. I've just darted it. So don't worry, but they're a nocturnal species that live underground. And I must say, darting a nocturnal animal that lives underground has its challenges, to say the least. I've spent many, many hours sitting outside aardvark burrows in the freezing Kalahari nights. Had some amazing sightings, like a wildcat catch a mouse 2 meters away from me, and also waiting outside an aardvark burrow only to be challenged by 2 porcupines. I can tell you that porcupines do not fire their quills, but they do stamp their feet and reverse into you. So just in case you're ever in that situation. So yeah, I was, working with this research group and enjoying it, but I was also being this wildlife vet at a time when South Africa was experiencing an exponential rise in rhino poaching. And this graph can show you here, from about 2008, this shows the number of rhinos that were being poached. So this massive, sharp increase, about a 9,000% increase in rhino poaching over these years. And when you think about back to that Operation Rhino story, we don't have a huge number of rhino to start off with. And, some people think that today Kruger's rhino population has declined by almost 60%. And, more than 1,000 rhinos killed each year between 2013 and 2017. So, this was partly sparked by increased demand for rhino horn, or very much sparked by that, and with the rising middle class in the East, and rhino horn being thought to have medicinal characteristics as well as status symbol. So yeah, that is what led me to then undertake a PhD in rhino conservation, because although the lessons learned from Operation Rhino were amazing, and we did learn a lot about how to work with these animals, the current sort of scourge in poaching meant that a lot of animals were severely compromised with their faces hacked off, and we needed to do much more to save the species, and we needed to be able to better work with them and better move them and do more sophisticated procedures, including dehorning and facial reconstruction. So my work really made it easier to treat wounded rhinos and to move them to safety and do procedures like dehorning. So, I kind of thought I'd reached quite a good epitome of my career. I was the, rhino vet flying helicopters around Kruger National Park, was having a good time. My veterinary wildlife career was going relatively well. But, in that time, it was at the height of poaching, and those many hours I spent in a helicopter, we would see carcass after carcass. You would just see circles of vultures, and you knew that every time you saw this group of vultures, there was a rhino carcass underneath them. And the one day we were flying looking for a rhino for me to dart for the study, and we saw a female rhino down, but she wasn't quite dead, and she had a calf sort of running around her. We landed the chopper just to check on her, and as we got closer, we realized that she was actually severely wounded. Her face was just about completely hacked off. She had axe wounds on her legs because the poachers had obviously tried to stop her from running away, but then, hadn't killed her completely. So, and she had this calf, beside her that was squealing. And unfortunately, despite the work I was doing with my PhD, she was actually just too severely compromised to help. And the ranger had to end up shooting her just to put her out of her misery. And so that episode really stuck with me, and especially just seeing that calf squealing and running around this poor mother and having to watch the mother get shot. Luckily, we could take that calf and put it in a rhino orphanage, and hopefully it grew up and lived a decent life. But yeah, it was a turning point that I really realized I didn't understand these global forces, and I needed to do more to be able to nudge systems and, increase my own knowledge about the way the world works. So that is how I ended up at Stanford doing an MBA. Yeah, that's you heard right. A South African rhino vet goes to Stanford GSB. So as you can imagine, it was a massive shock and big eye opener. Not only because I had absolutely zero business background and knew nothing about economics, finance. I didn't know what a VC was, private equity, nothing. so that was a shock. But I also, what was shocking to me is that I realized I surrounded myself in a conservation bubble. People around me spoke what I spoke. We all had this desire for conservation and wildlife conservation, and I thought it was almost a global norm. But going to the GSB, I realized that, this narrative of biodiversity conservation and the importance of natural climate solutions and preserving our biodiversity for all was just not in this sort of general teaching at the GSB. And similarly, in the wildlife world, I was never exposed to the fundamental business lessons, which can be very positive for conservation. So this sort of realization got me interested in bridging the business, conservation, and academic worlds, realizing the lack of interdisciplinary work and the huge benefits that conservation could gain from some business skills and vice versa. So, yeah. I know time, sorry, I'll just move on quickly. So currently I'm working for Herding for Health, which does in some way combine my veterinary, wildlife, academia, and business backgrounds. And in this program, we focus on local pastoralists who farm alongside wildlife. So pastoralists, they untenured farmers, they graze in communal lands, and they previously marginalized communities. They're actually, traditionally have been excluded from many of their former grazing lands through, in fact, conservation efforts, because some, bringing protected areas that put up fences and put people out and animals in really excluded these people and sort of started an animosity between conservationists and farmers. And so we're working to really improve the business case for conservation, helping improve livelihoods of these farmers so that they can see the value of caring properly for the land. And that value, hopefully flows through to them. And we're realizing we need to provide the skills, tools, and the enabling environment for rural livestock farmers to farm with rather than against nature. And so, yeah, looping back to the Operation Rhino, one of the greatest conservation stories, and it still is, and it was great, but it was very much focused on, protecting a species. And we now, thankfully, are moving much more to a systems level approach and acknowledging that people are very much part of that system. So today, thankfully, conservation in Africa is taking a much more sort of community-based natural resource management approach, and realizing that the value of natural systems needs to flow back directly to the stewards of that land. And so just to finish, one of our top farmers in these communal lands famously said, help us protect our cattle and we will help you protect your rhino. So just showing that our communities living alongside wildlife could be our greatest untapped resource when it comes to wildlife conservation in Africa. So yeah, thank you very much. That's the end of my little intro. But just to say, obviously it's never the end. We're always learning, and watch out for the next chapter, both in Africa's conservation story as well as my conservation story. So thank you very much. And I'll now hand over to Jordana.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Can you guys hear me okay? Let me just get this shared. And there we go. Okay. Everybody see that okay? Great. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Anna. That was such an awesome interview, and what a journey you have been on. I love your story. It's been great. So I'm going to share with you more, digging into some of the techniques now that we are going to use, more of a novel approach to measuring ecosystem recovery, kind of untangling the web of life using environmental DNA. And the big take home I'm going to hopefully give you is a good understanding of what that means and how we do it. So as Anna shared her journey with you, I thought I'd share a little bit of mine. I was a farm girl from Illinois, loved my livestock, loved my animals. And then after college, what was next was just moving on to bigger cows and bulls in the form of elephants. Loved reproduction and wanted to help increase reproductive success in endangered species, which brought me to being an endocrinologist, which I studied hormone levels, pregnancies, stress levels to better understand populations of elephants and black rhino in Southern Africa. And all my work evolves around poop, and that continued to follow me through to Stanford. I decided to completely switch fields from endocrinology to genetics because there is so much amazing novel sequencing technologies that are currently going on and allowing us to do things that we haven't been able to do before and ask questions. And I just had to know how to do that. So that's what I'm going to share with you today is and what I learned from Stanford and now how I'm applying that in a consultancy that I started called Webs of Nature, where we help organizations across Africa develop ways to measure their system health at a more systems approach instead of individual species approach. So environmental DNA, I'm not sure if everybody's heard about this. You might have heard of eDNA. It's been in the media a lot lately because we're finding out that DNA is even floating around in the air, and we can identify that now to the species level, which is incredible. So we're constantly shedding DNA into the environment. Trees are doing the same, animals, and we are now able to pick up and identify very degraded small fragments of DNA. So we can collect that from water samples, soil samples, and even air. And how this works, I want everybody to have a good understanding of this, is in the mitochondria, there's hundreds to thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA. And so that's what we target because there's a lot more of it out in the environment. And then that actual genome across vertebrates actually has all the same genes. So for instance, let's say we're looking at mammals, we want to target specifically the 12S gene. We can now make universal primers that lock onto that. And what is different is all the little nucleotides in between. And this is what's called the actual barcode. So those tiny little differences can be the difference between a deer or a mountain lion. And this is what we're targeting now from these different samples. And what's exciting is we don't actually ask, is there one species in there, but I can ask, what are all the species in that sample? And it all depends on the reference database that we are creating, but there's a global wide effort to have these sequences in a shared database so we can identify the biodiversity on a global scale using these new methods, which is very exciting. So this is what brought me to Stanford. I just had to know what it was all about. And as you can see here, one sample of water, we're able to pick up all the fish in there, the amphibians, even the jaguar that drank from it, the bats that flew over or drank that night. We can actually pick up those tiny little pieces. So as you can imagine, it's changing how we measure biodiversity, and we're actually able to identify across all the kingdoms, as you see here. And what's really exciting is it's very accessible. Anybody in the world can actually collect these samples. And so it's a super community science project. As you see here, the woman is collecting samples of water. So you're just pushing water through and all the DNA is collected on a tiny sample. And then once you have that collected DNA, you can send that off to a lab. And then that's where all the analysis take place. But same with soil sample. There's a lot of community science projects to get people to collect from around the world and contribute. So I find that very exciting, and especially in places where we're working with all the communities around all these protected spaces, everybody can get involved. However, being in the conservation field for the past 20 years, I realized the most critical part of biodiversity that actually regulates the integrity, functions, and services of all Earth's ecosystems is actually not being measured by conservation organizations. We're very focused on counting species and the growth in those numbers of individual species. However, what's more important are the species interactions. This is the true architecture of biodiversity and the foundation of a healthy ecosystem. So this is your food web within, and understanding that network of interactions actually gives us a very good idea of the resilience and the functioning of a system. And the simplification of these networks actually reduces the functioning of a system. And I'll go into more detail of that. So this is just to showcase how everything is connected within a system. I know it's cliche and we all hear that, but it is. The microbes, communities make for a healthy soil, which allow for a healthy vegetation, which feed the herbivores in this picture through to the pollinators and your predators in that system. So everything is connected and linked in that system. However, we're losing a lot of these species and they're going extinct. When an elephant's lost, it's not just the elephant that's lost, it's all the interactions that are lost. And that is what we always leave out. And when we're talking about the loss of species, it actually has a whole knock-on effect through the entire system. And we have these secondary extinctions because of that. And around the world, these are just representing the different interactions that take place. We have species that are actually being reintroduced or now introduced, like cats, into environments that other animals have not evolved with them. And we have these new interactions taking place. We've got systems becoming disconnected across areas. And exciting that we are reconnecting animals that have been out of systems for maybe 50 years, as Anna was talking about just recently with these rewilding programs. So the big question is, how do we measure all these species interactions and the rewiring of the food webs that are actually taking place in these changing times right now? And that's where a lot of my work really focused and brings me back to boop again. So for 20 years, I have been working with feces. I cannot get away from it, even at Stanford. This allows me to connect everything through environmental DNA diet, so fecal diet analysis. And then coupling that with network theory. Many of you might be familiar with network theory. It's used for social interactions, as we see here with the elephant social network, is used to understand the impacts of poaching. We do it on Facebook and even in neuroscience networks to understand functional relationships between brain regions, just to give you an idea of all the different areas. And we also use it in ecological network analysis. And it's kind of the math behind how everything is connected within an ecosystem. And now, within that ecosystem. So we can take what we have drawing these lines together to actually measuring that complex system of interactions, as you see in that picture here. So there's been a shift now, I'm hoping, and from past conservation management, where we're focusing on these, individual parks and individual species, to actually, I cross that out because it's not the way of the future. It's now. This is what we are needing to do and applying currently is to look at interaction networks and ecosystem processes and protecting those spaces as a whole, because networks really provide one of the best representations for ecological communities across this space. So very exciting. Oh, there we go. So what I did actually in the backyard, many of you might be familiar with Jasper Ridge, worked on developing this technique called molecular ecological network analysis. We call it MINA, I'll just call that throughout. But it's taking all those, it's trying to capture all those interactions within an environment through the diet eDNA, water eDNA, and soil eDNA, and then quantifying this through the DNA metabarcoding. So using those universal markers to look at the different taxa from all the vertebrates, the invertebrates, targeting amphibians and the microbes within the soil systems. And then getting your sequencing outputs, identifying species, and then creating these network analysis across that space. And then the outcomes for strategic management decisions is just incredible. This looks like a long list, but there's an incredibly long list actually of all the different benefits that you can get out from MINA, from biodiversity surveys, ecological integrity assessments, community structure, composition, and function, early detection of invasive species, identifying rare species that normally we can't pick up, maybe from other methods such as camera traps, understanding the soil and water health of a system. And so the list goes on. And this is just a simple figure to show that when we measure the robustness of an ecosystem network, we can actually measure the robustness of that network. It correlates quite nicely with the ecosystem service robustness, the outputs of that ecosystem. So very exciting measurement tool. So after graduating, we wanted to actually apply the work and not just have it as a white paper, as a publication. And African Parks is an organization, it's an NGO that's based in South Africa that actually works across Africa in helping governments to manage their national parks. A lot of times we call it paper parks, where on paper it looks like it's a designated park space, but a lot of times countries just don't have the funding to be put in there to take care of these areas. And a lot of them are deforested and defaunated. So African Parks comes in to help with securing these spaces, rewilding these areas, and working with the communities within that space to help protect these areas. They work in 12 countries across 22 national parks currently and 20 million hectares. And they really wanted a way to take a systems approach to measuring recovery across these areas. They wanted to measure like how healthy is this ecosystem and how is that changing across time. And so we are going to be proposing we are doing this actually across their parks. We currently have a pilot. This is just to showcase that all the different biomes that they are covering across time. And as you can see, they're doing an excellent job of protecting all of these different areas. And looking forward to, measuring this recovery across these areas. So African Parks in general goes into these degraded, disconnected, defauned, rewired networks. As we were talking about earlier, they come in to protect, rehabilitate, population recovery, and rewilding these areas. So hoping that MINA can help with the biodiversity assessments, measure the trophic interactions, the ecosystem ecology, and the health of the system, and inform value of novel species, and actually identify the keystone and vulnerable species within their systems. So this is some of the current methods. We always have to do aerial surveys to get counts, but hoping now to be going into these systems and actually collecting the different metrics across here. So this is a picture of working up in the DRC. We work with the rangers, and all the rangers are part of the project, and they're the ones on the ground and to be trained. So they'll be collecting the fecal samples. I was just recently in Angola last week and working with students there to collect the water samples to work towards this. And what's really exciting is the capacity building that's taking place within this space, because so much data is produced from this that not only will we get our targeted questions that African Park needs to help manage it, but all the spin-off questions to work with the local students in the area, local masters and PhD students to help them with that, which is, I find, incredibly exciting. And with that, thank you. And please reach out if you have any questions on anything. Thanks, everybody. And on to you, Simon.
Great, thank you, Jordana. I'm gonna also share some slides with you. Thanks everyone for listening in. It's great to have such an audience and to be the other panelists. So thank you for the opportunity. As mentioned, I work for Value Nature, where our vision is to ensure that nature is valued to its true self, and that the local biodiversity custodians that are responsible for nature are able to thrive, and that planetary health ensured through that process. And so what we're really working off the back end of is at the end of last year, the Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15, which was held in Canada, was signed. And the focus of that output was the Convention on Biological Diversity signing to protect 30% of the world's conservation landscapes by 2030. This comes at a huge cost to be able to do this, to be able to halt biodiversity loss. But there are some elements that are working towards us. For example, in the European Union, there's regulations that are going to enforce corporates to disclose their biodiversity dependencies and their impacts. This is done also in hand with things like the TNFD, which corporates are signing up for, also the science-based targets for nature, which we're seeing a lot of corporates signing up for. So there's definitely a big global shift towards understanding biodiversity. I think that there's been such a huge focus on climate to date that biodiversity is kind of been in the wings slightly, but there's a greater and greater realization on the importance of biodiversity and the role that it has on all of our functioning and systems. I think the estimate was more than 50 or 60% of global GDP is actually revolves around nature itself. So during the signing of the Global Biodiversity Framework, voluntary biodiversity credits were identified as a financing tool to be able to help. It's definitely not going to be the only thing, but something that can help us increase the amount of revenue that's going into our natural area. And so that's what Value Nature focused in on and is starting to develop. There is no current market per se for voluntary biodiversity credits. You can think of them in a similar way to how corporates are buying carbon credits, but these all voluntary are distinct from carbon credits in the fact that they are not used and will not be designated as direct offsets. So you don't buy a voluntary biodiversity credit to offset some harm that you've done somewhere else. There's a huge market already for regulated biodiversity credits and offsetting that happens globally. Many countries have their own kind of legislation and processes behind that. This is a new market where we are hoping to see corporates investing into nature almost as a nature positive commitment, and in terms of and almost kind of corporate social responsibility. You could think of it almost like corporate environmental responsibility into investing in nature. And so that certificate that is going to be issued, the word credit and certificate is interchangeable a lot through this process, but the Biodiversity Credits Alliance, which I'll go into just now, has identified voluntary biodiversity credits as a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of biodiversity gain. And so those gains are identified in different ways. So for example, biodiversity gain could encapsulate the uplift in biodiversity that happens. You could think about this in terms of population recoveries, habitat recovery, in terms of vegetation. This could be also encapsulated through the reduction of threats to a project site, and all the maintenance of pristine areas that biodiversity custodians have done a great job of protecting to date, but need additional financial support to ensure that continued protection. So what is a biodiversity credit? This is a group that has come together to safeguards and policies for the creation of this market right up, rather than to try and retrofit kind of global principles, integrity principles, governance principles, a coalition of organizations, including Value Nature, got together and engaged with the United Nations Development Program, as well as the Environmental Program, and got them to facilitate the discussions and create the Biodiversity Credit Alliance to develop and consider these safeguards and guardrails. And so its mission is really to bring that clarity and guidance right at the beginning of this market as we start thinking about the market and trying to scale it, and to think about it under these kind of core principles, and to ensure that the financial flows get to where they need to be, which is on the ground into the hands of the biodiversity custodians. And so it's largely managed and run by a task force, which includes a number of thousands. This number is growing, but the focus of the task force is to create issue papers and those guiding principles that I mentioned. Those feed down into the BCA's forum, which is made up of about 100 members at the moment, which includes corporates, NGOs, interest parties. And the goal of the whole kind of program is to make sure that we can define and categorize biodiversity credits effectively right in the beginning, so that we don't have different types of credits that are being created and or typologies, to try and identify those principles I mentioned. And then right in the beginning, we've realized that to be able to scale that market and to meet the 30 by 30 goals, that we've got to incorporate digital approaches and digital standards, which I think, obviously the community that I'm talking to here out of Silicon Valley well understands the value of these kind of technologies, and to be able to help these kind of markets to be able to scale. And the Biodiversity Credit Alliance is also going to create a peer review mechanism for the methodologies that will be created. One of the distinctive differences between the carbon market and biodiversity is that carbon is represented by a very simple unit, which is tons of carbon per hectare, whereas in the biodiversity case, you can imagine there's so many different ways of quantifying and measuring biodiversity and thinking about biodiversity. And so at the end of the day, there needs to be very clear sound science and peer review mechanisms to ensure that the biodiversity at a local project site that is being monitored and reported on, and the gains that are being created, are fit for purpose for the local context. I mentioned some of this digital approach to you, but really the key there is to ensure that trust, transparency, traceability are incorporated into accrediting structures, which we also see a lack of, for example, in the carbon market. And so there's a lot of learning from the carbon space and kind of a clean slate to kind of take things forward here. So we at Value Nature have developed a biodiversity credit framework. There's multiple frameworks that have been developed globally. There's one come out of Colombia, one out of New Zealand, there's one out of the United Kingdom. There's multiple of these different frameworks. And that kind of diversity that we're seeing in frameworks is just representative of the biodiversity, the diversity of biodiversity. And so in our case, one of our biodiversity certificate represents a hectare of land protected or restored over a 10-year period. And we have a 30-year window of permanence that we're looking towards. The idea behind the sale of the credits is to generate revenue that goes into a special purpose vehicle or to the landowner to ensure the conservation or restoration of that landscape, and to ensure that the local infrastructure and things like green jobs can secure the biodiversity in a region. And so over that 30-year window, you can imagine that every 10-year period, we're able to create another certificate for that hectare. And through that, also generate a drawdown into an endowment fund, which will go towards securing the biodiversity into the future. As you can imagine, as you're securing biodiversity at a project site level, as the project costs will decrease as that biodiversity value increases over time. So what exactly are we measuring over this 10-year period, and what is being reported to the certificate? are two elements, the fauna and the flora. So on the flora side, we have a habitat index that is largely informed the remote sensing component. It gives us an indication of what the current status of the landscape is like and how that changes over time against a benchmark. And so what would we expect this landscape to look like? And we can kind of index it against to what its current status is. So how degraded is it? How pristine is that landscape? We then use in-field monitoring tools for the wildlife index, and we've selected 3 tools that can be deployed by local actors with limited amount of skills that are required. And this ensures that we don't have high costs of trying to get experts into the field, but can rather use local talent as much as possible. So bioacoustics are small little recorders that are easily deployed, data collected and put into the cloud for analysis. Environmental DNA, Jordana just went through a whole process there, but here's a picture of a field ranger collecting some DNA from scat when we were in the Congo. And then camera traps, again, tools can be easily set up and the data is stored and put up into the cloud. And so in the environmental DNA case, sorry, I didn't mention, samples can be collected and shipped off for analysis elsewhere. So that means that the local biodiversity custodians have the means of collecting information themselves and have simple approaches to be able to get that information analyzed and reported on. Going the wrong way here. And so all of this information is then encapsulated into a dashboard for reporting to the certificate. And here's an example of a dashboard for a community wildlife concession, where we have the habitat index and the wildlife index that informs a broad overall ecosystem integrity score. And so in the global biodiversity framework, they identified ecosystem integrity as a key component of what should be reported on. And in this dashboard, you could go down and look at things like the camera traps, look at some of the camera trap images, listen to some of the acoustics, and really get a sense of what's happening on the ground and that reporting and how that changes over time and how those gains are made and all the recovery is made on the landscape. And so we're working as a starting point on 4 pilots, 3 in Africa, 1 in Colombia. And just to give you a little sense of what that includes, I thought I'd just showcase the Zambian project as a starting point. And so this is a 350,000 hectare area. It's nestled in between a number of other protected areas. There's 2 national parks on either side of it, big lake systems that is incorporated in. So the livelihoods of the people living within this area is focused a lot on fisheries, and there's some grassland areas as well. But unfortunately, most of this area has been defaunated, so a lot of bushmeat removal from the area and a lot of impacts from shifting agriculture, slash and burn techniques, as well as a lot of just runaway fires that go into the system, which they use to kind of chase animals into snare lines. And so the focus on the project is really the recovery of that in hand with the local custodians, and trying to identify different ways of approaching resource use and implementation in that area. And so I mentioned the remote sensing. We really look at from a remote sensing perspective, we can look at land cover change over time. So we started in 2017 with remote sensing data and are able to look at land cover change over time and see what's happening and report on that. And then the next step as the project starts this year is the deployment of camera traps, environmental DNA, and the bioacoustic devices, as I mentioned. To give you a sense of the scale, when I mentioned 350,000 hectares, the outer ring around San Jose over there gives you an idea of the scope and scale of this landscape. And so when you're thinking about monitoring at that scale, you've got to think of using stratified monitoring approaches where we get representative indications of what's happening in the different landscapes. And so we can't have a camera trap on every hectare. So we've got to do select areas to get a representation of what's happening on the ground. And a little bit more detail in terms of how we also approach this from a carbon perspective. So here's some detail on the project. I think some of these slides will be available to you later to look at some of the detail if you're interested. As an example, in these landscapes, there's obviously going to be some carbon recovery as well. So we can actually create carbon credits as additional value add to the investors of the biodiversity certificates. And so they could kind of claim those offsets for the work that they did, for their investment. I think that kind of wraps things up. I've got more detail here, but I think we're running short of time. I'd love to answer some questions as we go forward. So thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Simon, and all the presenters. We have about 7 minutes left for Q&A. I see there was already an active discussion in the Q&A window, so thank you for that. We had a couple of questions that came in prior to the webinar, so I'll pose those to the panelists now. The first one was, with humanity having taken so much mental distance and separation from nature and our inherent interconnectedness with it in the centuries since the Industrial Revolution, how do we engender a tacit and passionate understanding in people of the importance of biodiversity and nature conservation as a whole?
That's a big question.
Anyone, feel free to jump in.
I can start off there. I think global consciousness and the shifts that we've seen, especially post-COVID, in terms of understanding of the environment and the impacts that it's had, has been great to see. And so I think, you know, we change, our cultures change, our approaches change, and we need to embrace those. And for those of us that have our conservation, sustainable interests at mind, we need to kind of use these opportunities to help guide things in the right direction. So I know not a complete answer, but an element of it.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, Jordan, if you have something to add, but just quickly, you know, I worked a little bit with the Natural Capital Project, and they've done a lot of work on cities and you know, bringing nature into cities. And I think that can play a huge role in helping people in their everyday lives realize the value of having intact ecosystems and thriving ecosystem services. And there's studies to show, you know, improvement in well-being and things that we all know about. So yeah, I think it's you know, it's all around us.
Yep. Well answered by both of you. We'll leave it at that. Now there's many more questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks. The second question was, is there any place for conservation psychology in the wildlife conservation effort? And what can psychologists and counselors do? How can we work from the top down to raise awareness for conservation?
Can I just say an interesting thing on that? I know in China, they're actually, I believe it's China, that they're actually prescribing walks in nature, and they're getting you know, doctor notes for that, and it's all being accepted that, you know, this is a treatment. You need to be out in nature, actually. And we've Anna can speak to this. They've done a lot of work with Natural Capital on understanding the benefits of being out in nature, both mentally and physically, and in a very short period of time. So I find that, yeah, that it's actually become prescribed.
In Canada as well, I think, you know,
oh, Canada, yeah,
doctor's certificate, you know, 2 hours you need to go to a nature reserve, national park.
Yeah. So I think that says a lot right there, that we're aware of that now, and it's part of treatments that psychologists are involved with.
Simon, anything to add?
No, I would love to get that prescription from my local doctor. So yeah.
There is a follow-up to the previous question in trying to get more people, you know, understand the value of nature conservation. Do you feel there are any leverage points in particular that would be impactful in the education system?
I think I mentioned it briefly, but I think a leverage point would be, for example, we all had a massive impact from the COVID and an understanding of where that originated from, or how susceptible we are to these types of impacts that in some cases could be driven by things like the illegal wildlife trade, the expansion of agricultural areas into novel forest landscapes and the likes, where these types of exposures to novel diseases could come from. And so I think that could be used in the current education system to make sure that children, it wasn't just a bump in our history, but that they actually understand what happened there and what that means for us, and how we can rectify some of those impacts, and how our resiliency as a population and as from a global health perspective can be heavily impacted by natural forces that are out there.
Yeah, that's great. I just wanted to follow on with that, we're not taught about conservation often in our school systems. It's not usually a topic, and that it needs to be more common, and that nature is not something that's just beautiful and that we set it aside because of its beauty and because we like those animals. But the understanding that we're all part of that system, and without trees, without grass, without wildlife, without functioning systems, we are all going to die. And we actually need those trees. We need all of it to actually survive on the planet. And I think there's in the past been a huge disconnect with that, that it's not needed. We can use it and abuse it as much as we want, and it doesn't matter. And yes, we'll set some aside so we have a place to be tourists, and but that it actually is functioning this is where the whole natural capital comes from, that Anna worked a lot in that space. So you can probably say a lot more, Anna.
Yeah, no, just dead on. And I think, bringing in a more systems approach to education as well. And, that conservation and wildlife conservation, biodiversity is all part of all the systems we learn about. So whether we're learning about food and farming, we need to understand all the environment and ecology behind that. And, as I said, something I'm passionate about, like, I don't think there's enough acknowledgement of the importance of thriving ecosystems and the value of natural capital in our business education and business leadership, and just the way that GDP is calculated, it doesn't bring in the costs of environmental degradation. So that's a whole nother story on itself. But how do we, look at our value system properly so that we do value the services that are given to us from nature?
Thank you for that. I'm sorry to cut off the discussion, but we are coming up on the hour. Thank you so much to the panelists for these insightful presentations, and thank you to the participants for all your engagement. As mentioned at the beginning, you'll get a recording of the webinar via email, and I hope you found the webinar valuable and will join future SAS events. So again, thank you everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Yes.